Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Marie. Today I'll be doing my July wrap up. So July came at a surprise because I read a total of 11 books. I really thought that I was struggling for most of the month, but I guess somehow when I actually calculated how many books that I finished, etc., a lot of them were like chunky books and I read 11 of them, which I'm actually really proud of myself for doing so. So as always, just a quick rundown of the stats that I gave for my 11 books that I read. I gave one book 2 stars. This was definitely my lowest rating. Everything else was actually pretty great. I gave 3 books 3 stars, 1 book 3.5 stars, 4 books 4 stars, and 2 5-star reads. So like I said, overall like pretty decently good month in terms of the quality. I just had one book that was not so great, but overall I'm pretty pleased. The first book that I want to discuss today is The Similars by Rebecca Hanover. This book I gave 4 stars. This book is essentially a young adult sci-fi novel. It follows the fact that 6 clones have now recently entered Emma's boarding school, and one of them just happens to wear the face of her best friend Oliver. Obviously she wants nothing to do with them, but she somehow ends up getting involved with their tiny clique and soon asks herself, like, what are the chances that these clones, these 6 clones, these illegal 6 clones, all happen to be of students from the exact same boarding school. And so as she gets entangled more and more with these questions, she also ends up discovering a lot of secrets about her school's past. I really like the premise of this book, and I just really enjoy reading about all the technological advances that this book had. For example, like self-driving cars was the norm. They also had these like virtual PAs essentially that could spoke to you and interacted with you. They had these keys that were like actual keys but were able to like have your fingerprints, everything, so it actually becomes like you and it only works for you. It was just really cool reading about all of the different little like technology that was super advanced in this book. I also really enjoyed the mystery element. There were so many plot twists and turns that I had a really fun time just discovering and just finding out what exactly the school was hiding. My biggest issue was actually the romance. I just feel like there's just some books where there really isn't a need for romance, and this is definitely a book where I felt like the romance was just not done well. I didn't like where it ended up with, like who ended up with who, and I actually found it to be a little bit distasteful, and there's just something about who she ends up with that left a weird like scent or like a weird taste in my mouth. I'm not gonna go into it because, you know, spoilers, but I mean, I feel like if you read a lot of young adult fiction, you kind of know exactly who her love interest is, and you'll kind of see like why it just seems like a little bit weird. Like, I don't know, it's just weird. And so while I did overall enjoy this book, I don't think I'm going to continue on with the series. I did feel that by the end of this book, I kind of see like the trajectory of where the series will continue or how it'll go. And so I also have other books I want to read, so I'm just like, maybe not. Oh, and I did talk about this book a lot more in detail during my 24-hour readathon, so I will link that vlog up above and down below in case you want to check that out. The next book I want to discuss is A Brilliant Death by Amy Rose Capetta. This book I gave 3 stars. This is a young adult fantasy where it follows a girl called Theodora who has been secretly changing her family's enemies into these inanimate objects as long as she can remember. But her family actually has no idea in terms of her magical abilities, and to them magic is just a fantasy. However, everything changes when the new ruler, the capo, ends up poisoning all the heads of the 5 family, including her own father, and now he is actually dying. And so she must now go to the capital to find a way to save him, but she has to go as a boy instead. I actually haven't heard too much about this book, so I didn't really know what to expect going into it, and I actually was pleasantly surprised and pleased overall. I really like the gender fluidity because there were these 2 characters in this book that could literally change from boy to girl, girl to boy whenever they felt like it, and I thought that was a really cool element. And it wasn't just side characters, they were just like prominent characters. There's also a lot of great gender discussions, such as traditional gender roles and the things that need to change. The book was also very fast paced with a lot of interesting characters, but the main reason why I gave this book 3 stars is I felt like at the end of the day, it felt like I just read through this so fast that it was more like a fever dream. Like even now when I'm remembering the book, I don't remember like a lot of the details. I just remember like, oh, like just general plot points. So that's why I ended up giving this book just 3 stars. Then this next book that I want to discuss is One Last Stop. This book I gave 4 stars. This is a young adult, kind of young adult, like they're college students. Like contemporary romance. It follows a girl called August who just recently moved to New York City, and after living life in a very cynical manner and being all alone, she can't imagine life changing that dramatically. However, she ends up finding herself moving into an apartment with a bunch of weirdos and starts waitressing at this seemingly magical diner. And not only all of that, but one day she ends up going on the train and somehow ends up bumping into this most gorgeous girl ever called Jane. And now it seems that for that summer, bumping into Jane on that train every single day is the highlight of her existence. Unfortunately though, she soon realizes that Jane is actually somehow out of time and is actually from the 70s. So now she's trying to figure out a way to get Jane back to her own time, but also somehow keep her own heart from breaking. So for most of this book, like I would say the first half was more of a mystery in terms of like what exactly Jane was and how to get her back and like why was she stuck, etc., rather than a romance. And to be honest, I was actually more invested with the mystery element because I was so curious as to like how she got there, why is she there, like what happened to her, how can she go back. Like I had so many questions about Jane and, you know, just how she was out of time. However, about halfway through the book though, the book definitely took a turn and became more romance heavy. Like I would say that for the most of the book, like the first half, it was more like, okay, cool, you know, August totally has a hots for Jane and like it's like a crush kind of thing, but until that midway halfway point, it definitely that's when things started to feel a bit more real, and that's when I actually started to root for the two of them. But the best part about this book actually was the side characters. Her weirdo roommates were just so endearing, and I just really love reading about their interactions, the dynamics, all the little like quirks and everything. It's just a lot of fun. And like ironically enough, out of all the characters, I actually related to August the least, mainly because I just couldn't connect with her much. So that's probably why like for most of this book, like at least half of the book, I was like, okay, cool, like she just has a crush, like whatever, like I'm curious about this mystery element. But then it wasn't until like the end that I was like, okay, you know what, I'm actually rooting for the two of them. Things are starting to become a little bit more promising. I can kind of see like where she's coming from, like this attraction, etc. So yeah, I would say like I actually didn't like her the most because of that. Like it took me a long time for me to warm up to her, whereas the other characters like Milo, just everyone just was like immediately was just like they're fun, they're entertaining, they're just like, you know, really cool characters. So that's probably like the only thing I can say about this book really. Okay, then the next book that I want to discuss is The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart. This book I gave 5 stars. So I'm not sure if this is like a young adult or adult fantasy, but it's like kind of in the middle somewhere. But it's definitely a fantasy book where it follows an emperor who has been essentially keeping control of his rule of the empire through this bone shard magic, where he's essentially able to create these like animal-like constructs who obey him. However, his rule is slipping because people are starting to get upset with his use of the bone shard, as they actually come from the people, and when he uses these little bone shards, they actually slowly drain the people's lives. And originally his magic actually used to defend against the enemies, but it's been a very, very long time, and to the point where people have started to forget who the enemies are, that they'll ever come back, and so they just don't see a need really for the emperor to continue using his bone shard magic. The book follows Lynn, who is actually one of the main characters, who is just trying to prove to her father, the emperor, that she is able to rule, and does so by starting to learn about the bone shard magic. And the book also follows multiple other characters to kind of get a better sense of the world. Another main character would be Jovis, who is actually a smuggler, and it kind of talks about his like role in all of this. This book was beautifully crafted, beautifully written. I loved everything about this book. The world building, even though it is so rich and detailed, I never once felt lost or confused, and I think that's a great testament to say, because a lot of fantasies, I feel like because you're introduced to a whole new world, there's magic involved, there's like creatures involved, there's a lot of like magic system, like world building, a lot of things in play, that is so easy for readers to just get confused. And I feel like most of the time when I read these fantasy books, I'm always a little bit confused for part of the book until like things start to make sense for me, and then I'm like, okay, like I finally understand what's going on. This book though, not really. Like I was immediately like enamored. I got like on board so fast. And like I said already, Lid and Jovis were definitely the two main characters. The other characters more like side characters that just kind of gave insight on their situation and just get a better sense of the world. I love reading about the two of them, as well as Mephi. Like, he was just so endearing. Like, I just loved his character. I'm definitely intrigued with how the series will continue. As soon as I finished this book, I was like, shit, when is the next book coming out? I think it's coming out like sometime later this year, maybe. I have to double check, but I am so excited. Definitely cannot wait to continue the series. The series is so freaking good. Then the next book that I picked up is Rich People Problems by Kevin Kwan. This book I gave 5 stars. So this is the conclusion to the Crazy Rich Asians series. And this book was primarily focused on just like wrapping everything up, as well as giving a conclusion to the burning question that was throughout the entire series, and that's who will actually inherit Taraso Park. So this book finally answered that question, and it was just so exciting to read about. There's just so many things that finally concluded, like Ash's love life, what truly happened with Taraso Park, what's going on with all the cousins. Like, there's a lot of things about this book that finally concluded, and I was just really happy reading about all of that. And as always, like, this series just makes me laugh so hard. Just like all the characters, the dynamics, like everything about it, just like a really great read. I mean, like I said already multiple times, my favorite characters definitely be Ashley and Rachel. They were just so like really independent females. They knew what they were doing, they went out to get it, and I just really enjoyed and admired the two of them. The one unique thing about this book is that this book definitely delved a lot more into the grandmother's past, kind of like what happened to her when she was younger, what made her make the decisions, or what impacted her to make the decisions that she made present day, etc. And I found that to be so fascinating. There was just so many historical elements in this book that I was not expecting, but I really enjoyed. So it's sad that I finally finished a series. Like, this series is done now, but I am so happy that I finished at the same time because it was just a really good series. So the next book that I picked up is Call Down the Hawk by Maggie Stiffwater. This book I gave 4 stars. And this book basically is a spin-off trilogy from the Raven cycle, where it specifically follows Ronan and this new trilogy. And in addition to Ronan, it follows 2 other main characters. One is Jordan Hennessy, who is a thief and somehow tied to this dream object. And Carmen, who actually hunts down dreamers after discovering that her own brother is a dreamer as well as a killer. There's also this introductions of a bunch of new characters, such as moderators, who are the hunters, and visionaries, who are people who can actually see the future in relation to the dreamers. To be honest, this plot is really hard to describe because there was just a lot of elements and components to it, and it was like really vague but also not. Like, you just have to like read this book to understand. I really liked how this book just follows the same like writing style. It's like very airy, very whimsical, very dreamlike. And I liked how Ronan's family was more involved. Like, his 2 brothers were definitely way more involved in this book compared to the original series. And I felt like I learned a lot more about his brothers. The new characters are really interesting as well, like Carmen and Jordan, but I feel like they're not completely fleshed out yet. So I'm curious to see how they will continue to grow and develop in future books. I also have a ton of questions in terms of how this book ended that I definitely want to pick up the sequel as soon as possible. But the next book that I want to discuss is Cemetery Boys, which I gave 3.5 stars. I did talk about this book a lot more in detail in my Goodreads debut vlog, so I will link that above and down below in case you want to check that out. This book follows a guy called Yadriel, whose family is a little bit, they're having trouble accepting his gender. And as a witch, his gender is actually important to determine his magic, because apparently female witches have healing abilities and male witches have spirit abilities. So he's determined to everyone that he is in fact a brujo, and with the help of his cousins he ends up performing the ritual by himself, and then somehow ends up calling upon the wrong dead spirits. He meant to call up his cousin, but instead calls up a dead boy called Julian. Yadriel tries to fix his mistake immediately, but Julian is having none of it, and instead he is more interested in finding out why he's dead and how did he die, and his friends, like what happened to his friends. And so the 2 of them end up working together, and now Yadriel might realize that he doesn't really want Julian to leave. This book was super freaking adorable. I really love the whole identity and gender that was being discussed in this book, but my 2 biggest issue was the pacing and in the ending. The pacing was just so off because there were some times when it just felt so slow, like so slow, and the other times where it was just so fast that I was having trouble like keeping up. And the ending slash like who the culprit villain is was so obvious from like pretty early on that I was really hoping for, you know, like a plot twist or just something surprising, and unfortunately that was not the case. And while I love the romance, I also felt like in this book it was the same as like One Last Stop, where the first half of this book was a mystery. Like it was focused on the mystery, like who did it, why is Julian dead, like what's going on, all that stuff. And then halfway through the book it's suddenly like super romance heavy, and somehow like One Last Stop it worked, but somehow in this book it didn't work as much. I don't know why that's the case. Like there's just something about the two books that like the way how the author like, you know, portrayed it, it worked better in one book and it didn't work as well in the second book. And I just felt like I was rooting for the romance the entire time, but at the same time I felt like, I don't know, I just thought maybe it's because like their dynamic was like different from the beginning. Like One Last Stop was like a cute, like a meet cute situation for August at least, and in this book it was definitely not a meet cute situation. He was just like, I want to get rid of him, like I accidentally like called him up as a spirit and now I need to like, you know, put him back into the afterlife, all that stuff. And so like maybe that's the reason why, but there was just something about their dynamics that were just, it just didn't feel like as, it didn't click as much, I guess. It's hard to describe, but I mean I still rooted for the romance. I thought it was super adorable. I just felt like the transition from the mystery portion, like mystery heavy area, to the romance heavy was just not done like very fluidly or like seamlessly. So that was basically like my only issue with this book and why I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. Okay, then this next book that I want to discuss is The Kingdom of Copper by S.K. Chakabori, which I gave 4 stars. So this is the sequel to City of Brass, where the first book essentially follows Nari, who somehow accidentally summons a djinn called Dara, and he ends up whisking her off to Devabad, which is a city full of devas and shafits, who are essentially people with mixed bloods, like both deva and human blood. And this book essentially takes place like 5 years after the end of the first book. Obviously I'm not going to go much into what this book is about because obviously spoilers if you haven't read the first book. This was such a rich world. Like even to this day I'm like, wow, like there's just so much about this book that you're just constantly learning about the magic, about the different types of people, about their political conflicts, their dynamics, all that stuff, and I just really enjoy reading all of that. And I love that this book did not suffer second book syndrome. And like I said, like this book just definitely focused a lot more on the world building, like fleshing out all the different elements, especially the politics between the various jinn tribes, as well as the politics between the jinns and the shafits. And I liked how the characters just grew and changed a lot during this book as new information came to light. And I'm definitely excited, cannot wait to read the final book as soon as possible. The next book that I want to discuss is Permanent Record by Mary H.K. Choi. I am sorry to say, but this is a book that I gave 2 stars. This book follows a guy called Pablo who has been struggling with life ever since he stopped going to college because he had no money, and he has been dodging calls daily about his bills. He currently works at the local bodega, but obviously wishes for more in life. And one day at work, early shift, maybe like 3-4 in the morning, Liana enters his life, aka enters the bodega, and changes everything. The two of them end up connecting, but because of her fame and who she is, everyone finds out immediately about their relationship. I did not like this book at all. The romance felt so insta-lovey. Like they literally met together, like they had one encounter at the bodega, and it probably lasted like maybe 30 minutes or something like that, and somehow they were like instantly connected, and I was like, insta-love, guys? Like what? I mean, the whole encounter, like, okay, yeah, cool, they had a cute encounter, a meet cute situation, obviously, but it just seems so improbable that this will turn into something more. It just felt way too unrealistic and unrelatable to me, and it was just really hard for me to root about this romance and this book, because obviously the romance was like 99% of this book, that it's hard for me to love a book where I don't root for the romance, where, like I said, the romance is like majority of this book. And so because the romance is so like meh for me, the plot also was just very like mediocre as well. So for the most part, like I just really did not care about this book. The only reason why I give this book 2 stars is because I did like the discussions about Pablo's like ethnic background and his like cultural identity. Like some of that I found really fascinating. And some of the parts where he was struggling with college and trying to find what he wants to do with his life, like that was relatable to me. It was just like the romance part that I was just like not having it. And this book is literally romance. So yeah, like I just overall like was not super fond of this book. Okay, then this next book that I picked up is The Pariah by Anthony Ryan, which I gave 3 stars. I talked about this book a lot more in detail in my August arc reading vlog, so again I'll link that above and down below in case you want to check that out. So this is an adult fantasy where it follows a guy called Alan Scribe who was booted out of the whorehouse once he reached a certain age, and then from then he somehow found himself in the outlaw life where he follows an outlaw king called Declan. And despite some of the shady ass characters that were found in this like outlaw like group, they were still kind of family in a way based on all like the experience they shared together and how long they've been together, etc. Until one day when they're about to do some sort of like big plot for a dukedom, someone ends up betraying them all, and he is one of the last few remaining survivors. And since then he has been trying to get vengeance for what has happened, and somehow that path leads him on to become a soldier for the king's army. This book was hard to get into. I don't know why. It's like I read this so fast. Like it was a fast-paced book in that sense. Like I was just like enamored with his life story, but at the same time it was just so slow and not much action was happening. And for the most part it was actually more political intrigue rather than anything else. So this book was very character heavy and it spanned over years and years. And this is definitely not your typical fantasy book because I don't know, I just feel like fantasy books for me it's just like a great adventure. There's like magic involved. Like magic is one of the main components of fantasy for me, and this book had none of that, even though I think it says something about like magic here. It's like ancient magics, but I'm like, where is this ancient magics, guys? It's just not what I expected, I guess. So I don't know if I'm gonna pick up the sequel, just mainly because I was so like lukewarm about this book, and this book is a chunker. Like look at the size of this massive ass book. So because of that I'm like, do I really want to read through a very like another dense book where it's just like character heavy, there's just not a lot of action going on, there's like not a lot of plot, etc. that I don't know, like I don't know if I want to dedicate, like, and this book took me like 2 solid weeks to read, so I don't know, guys. Like that's also like the main reason why I was a little bit worried, because for like the first half of this month I was like, I wasn't even reading that much because of this giant ass book that I was reading. So once I finished that book though, the rest of the books that I read was like quicker, faster reads. So I don't know, I'm not sure. I'm still debating if I want to pick up the sequel or not, but yeah, this is like why I'm like, I mean, it's not bad. I like the character, I like following his life, but that was essentially it. Okay, then the last book that I want to discuss is Heart of Thorns by Brie Barton. This book I gave 3 stars. This is a young adult fantasy where it follows a girl called Mia who has been raised by her father to hunt against the Gurok, who are these females who somehow have magical abilities. However, things completely change for her when her father decides to marry her off instead, and now she is forced to marry into the royal family, which is so different than the life that she has imagined for herself. And so she ends up plotting to escape, and somehow during this escape she finds out that she herself possesses the same magic that she has been hunting for her entire life. I really enjoy the feminist messages in this book and how women were seen as like really strong, and that's why the men in this book were so intimidated by them. There's also Quinn, who is the love interest, and he was just a soft boy that I really enjoy reading about. But that being said though, like while I like the love interest himself, I actually didn't care too much about the romance. For me it just seemed very unrealistic, and the whole dynamic between him and me were just always so awkward. Like I just feel like I can't fathom them like being together. So this is another book that I will not be continuing on the series because I just felt like even though I enjoy this book overall, I don't care enough, like I'm not invested enough with the rest of the story, with the plot, to continue on when I have a ton of other books I want to read. So unfortunately though, I will be stopping my series with this book over here. But yeah, that's all I can say for this video. Let me know down below how your reading was like for the month of July. Did you read any great books? Have you read any of the books that I read this time around? As always, if you like this video, please do give me a thumbs up. It really does help my channel. And if you'd like to see more content of me, please do subscribe and hit the notification bell. As always, don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!